Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody here. I'm very pleased and excited actually to call you welcome to this new lecture and discussion series called techne. Making and crafting is inherent to human existence, as we all know, and the value of human capacity to make things is clear. We identify ourselves often through what we do and what we make. Just think about surnames like baker, carpenter. We even have a music group, an ancient music group with that title. And these names also exist in all possible languages within Europe and well beyond. Because it also, when we do something, it gives us potentially a little bit of control over a small part of a much bigger world around us. And that's one of the reasons why we not just do things and make things. Of course, we do it as a way of subsistence, but we also do it to be part of the world and to feel that we have something to say about the world around us. Making and creating are embedded in individuals, groups, legal, political and social institutions, and thus also in society overall. And in the last decade, approaches to crafts and making have been from different disciplines. So historical approaches, technological approaches, economical, archaeological, philosophical, anthropological viewpoints have been brought into the big basket of crafting and making. As I continue to work, as you probably know, or some of you may know, for Leiden University in the field of ancient technologies, materials and crafts, I've always wanted to set up a lecture series and a discussion forum like this, but never really had the possibility to do so. So when I came to Athens, I thought this is absolutely the perfect location to set this up. But I didn't want to set it up by myself, because as you just heard and also realize, it is an endeavor of different disciplines and a lot of people together in order to make sense of so much different data. So collaborative events across periods and regions bring out far more useful content than if we remain in our own contextual niche. Especially bringing people from different disciplines together helps in widening our views, helps in understanding and applying different methodological approaches, and helps also in understanding more deeply the topics that we want to discuss in the context and the field of techne. Looking beyond, therefore, our own contextual backyards, we actually turn into wanderers into other regions, into other periods that we're less familiar with and less well known to us. But you can compare that actually to the craftspeople themselves, currently and in the past, that at some stage in their career go and do a job elsewhere. And as they are doing that and they're on the road, they learn from their colleagues a lot of useful things and they exchange their knowledge with these people. Our technical lecture and discussion events aims to look at humans in their interaction with non-human agencies, such as materials, but also animals, and especially through the making and crafting. And we will place these networks of interactions in the context of wider societies and communities. Of interest, therefore, is to observe differences and similarities in a wide range of periods and a range of contexts, and to try to explain also these differences and similarities as we go along. So by bringing people together from different disciplines, I hope we will achieve this goal. As I said, I didn't want to do it alone, and I didn't have to do it alone. I'm very lucky and very fortunate to have a wonderful group of collaborators. These collaborators are Natasha Massar from the National Museum for Art and History in Brussels, Eleni Konstantinidis Ivridi from the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, who is here. Eleni, wave at us.
I'm the fortunate one. Participate in such collaboration. Thank you.
And so are we. Yorgos Papasavas from the Archaeological Research Unit in the University of Cyprus. So we also went looking at our very close neighbors, which I'm very happy about. Veronique Shankowski, the director of the École française d'Athens, who is following online with us, and Helle Hochscheid from the University College Roosevelt in the Netherlands. And we will hear about her again in a moment. What is now the techne series and what is it? Is it a lecture series? Is it a discussion series? What exactly is it? What we're trying to do, and we hope that participants will stick to, let's say, the little rules, is a short lecture, 30 minutes, with some information on a specific context and some methodology by the presenter with a discussant. And then we have some time for questions and discussions, because we believe that when it comes to aspects of crafting and making, and especially the technological aspects of it and the social aspects of it, that we learn far more from sharing experiences and discussing the matter than just listening and answering questions. The chronological framework had to be somehow restrained, although from the Bronze Age until the Roman period is still a very decent chunk, but we opted for not going into Byzantine and later periods and not back to the Neolithic period. Geographically, we look at both Western and Eastern Mediterranean, first of all, because they're very difficult to split up. It all depends on a viewpoint, and we're also very interested in interactions between the two regions. So we welcome interventions at that level. Because techne is such a large topic, we decided to have different subtopics every year. There's a whole wide range that we have discussed in our first meeting with the other collaborators, and this topic for this year is cross-craft interaction. It's my little baby for a very long time, as some of you know. What is cross-craft interaction? It's a variety of ways of looking at technology, at aspects of crafting and aspects of making. You can look at it from a material perspective, in the sense that when you have two crafts, there may be a crossover. I'll give you an example. Sven Hansen, who is very active in the Bronze Age Euro-Asian region, thought about the fact that when you look at metallurgy and the start of mixing metals to make the properties of metals stronger and better and more flexible and a variety of different properties, he was quite convinced that the inspiration for that mixing of metals actually came from pottery mixing, which again helps when you mix clay with sand and different fillers to change the properties accordingly. So that is a way of looking at cross-craft interaction. Another way of looking at cross-craft interaction from a material perspective is when craftspeople start sharing facilities, workshops, furnaces, but also on a more non-material level, knowledge, skills, tools, and a variety of aspects like that. So we can therefore look at cross-craft interaction from a material perspective, but also a social perspective, and you cannot separate them from each other. They really cross over also on that level. Just to give you an example here, we see the little fellow who I photographed a couple of years ago on a fresco painting course. He was mixing pigments without any problem whatsoever. So he was actually teaching me, in a way, how to crush pigments from mineral blocks that I brought along. I had blisters, he didn't. And it was the way he held the pestle that helped me understanding that, you know, I can learn from him. So passing on information and passing on knowledge without him telling me anything and without being a specialist, you can learn from each other. That's also cross-crafting. Pigments exist on a variety of different media. They exist on painted plaster, they exist on pottery, they exist on leather, they exist on textiles, and you name it. Pigments are everywhere. And I will finish, because otherwise it becomes too long, with a thank you to a lot of people. First of all, the collaborators of this whole group of people. So Natasha, Eleni, Jorgo, Veronique, Helle, and many other colleagues from Leiden, from Athens, and well beyond that, with whom I had the privilege to have lots of very fruitful discussions and arguments over the years. I want to thank also my colleagues here at NIA, Emmy Macri, who has sent out plenty of advertisements for this series, and that results in you all being present here. So thank you, Emmy. Thank you to Yanni Macri, who is just coming in and looks after the audiovisual and all the technical aspects of the series. Panayoti Gasparatos, who looks after the budgets and is very generous. And Galina Yatsenko, who you will meet afterwards when we go upstairs for a short drink. I also thank you all for being here, both online and in the room. And I would like to thank, of course, Helle Hochscheid, who will be our first speaker. And at such stage, I will introduce Helle briefly. She obtained her PhD at the University of Utrecht, Amsterdam. I thought it was Amsterdam, but I wasn't sure. Okay, Amsterdam. And is currently assistant professor of antiquity at the University College Roosevelt in the Netherlands, where she is teaching in the field of archaeology, antiquity, and heritage. Her monograph, Networks of Stone, Sculpture and Society in Archaic and Classical Athens, focuses on networks of patrons, artisans, and material suppliers that were active in sculpting processes and practices in the 5th and 6th centuries BCE. Beyond that monograph, she also edited and co-edited several very interesting volumes on crafting and making in the ancient world, and published extensively on making and crafting including aspects of labor specialization, identity formation and artisan status, and aspects of skill. She's the co-founder for the Ancient Sculpture Association, and she also works very actively on bringing archaeology into the primary school curriculum in the Dutch schools, which is a fantastic initiative through her project Archaeology in the Classroom, so that pupils learn early on the embedded power of objects and materials in the present and in the past. Helle, please come.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this first lecture of the techne series, and may many more follow, many more will follow, we know this. Thank you also for instigating this platform on the study of ancient techne. I am very grateful for having been invited and trying to get more insight into what ancient crafts meant in ancient societies. Now, for all of us whose interest lies with ancient craft, you will probably very much recognize that it can be hard to get away from craft. It simply seems to be everywhere, and especially here in Athens, if you walk around, there seems to be examples of the very special objects that are still being made in Greece nowadays, everywhere, not to speak, of course, of all the museums that are full of these wonderful objects. Now, equally, and my students who are here today, thank you very much for coming, you guys, will confirm, it can be very hard to stop talking about it. In my experience, people get a bit tired of me talking about craft, but unfortunately, we will have to do so tonight. And of course, we are in excellent company. In particular, already in Xenophon's Memorabilia, you have the contemporaries of Socrates complaining about him talking too much about the shoemakers, carpenters, and smiths. And this is my favorite translation of this passage. He apparently talked this topic into tatters. For the modern world, it may seem a little awkward or surprising that perhaps one of the greatest philosophical minds of the entirety of human culture would choose to talk quite so much about something like craft. Because of course we know that in other texts from the ancient world, crafts are not so positively evaluated and are in fact considered quite lowly. What I would like to argue today is that Socrates is in fact not an aberration or an innovator perhaps in talking about craft so much, even to explain complex philosophical concepts, but that actually he is more in line with a long-standing trend in which the Athenians from the archaic and classical periods very much appreciated craft and were aware of the crucial role that it played in their society. So I will argue that the appreciation that often speaks from Socrates' discussions and descriptions of craft is an extension of this long-standing appreciation in Athens in particular. And contrary to literary sources, I propose that the large and often prosperous craft community in Athens not only contributed much to this society, but that this was also acknowledged by the Athenians, and possibly in the form even of official status in the community of Athenians. Now, in order to make this argument, I have to piece together little clues from all over the material and literary record, because unfortunately there is no major new revelation to be found, of course, in this topic. But nonetheless, I'm going to be bold and start with that very epitome of classical Athenian craft production, the Periclean building project, with many thanks to Anasynthesis for producing this absolutely beautiful reconstruction of what that project in its full glory may have looked like. Now, the Periclean building program is without any doubt one of the most ambitious and celebrated building programs in the ancient world. It is intricately designed. There clearly has been an inordinate amount of thought that went into the design and the iconography of it, and last but not least, a huge number of work hours and labor hands, labor force was necessary to make this happen. Now, normally in an ancient Greek polis, if such a large project was about to set off, recruiters would have been sent out to other polis to find the craftspeople who could actually execute the work. The question that has been fueling much discussion among scholars for a long time actually is, was this also the case in Athens? So in Athens, was it necessary to find a majority of craftspeople and bring them specifically for the Periclean building program to at the time when it started? Now, interestingly, there are no unequivocal contemporary sources, but there is a later source that has something to say about this. And that is Pericles' life, Plutarch's life of Pericles, sorry. And I will read it out because I don't know if you can all read this on the screen. So Plutarch writes, in Pericles' desire that the unwarlike throng of manual laborers should neither have no share at all in the public receipts, nor yet get fees for laziness and idleness, he boldly suggested to the people projects for great constructions and designs for works which would call many arts into play and involve long periods of time, in order that the stay-at-homes, no less than the sailors and sentinels and soldiers, might have a pretext for getting a beneficial share of the public wealth. He then goes on to list an inordinate number of different crafts that are all necessary for this building project, and I will come back to that very long and interesting list a little bit later. And finally, he ends this passage with a short reference to the organization of the works. Now, this passage, forgive me for being slightly anachronistic, but I can't get away from the fact that it seems to be pointing at what might be described as some kind of employment scheme. So Pericles, Plutarch says at least, and of course this is a much later source, but let's stick with it for now. Pericles is saying, we have funds and we have a group of people who are out of work. What can we do? Let's start building something. And effectively, that's an employment scheme. But this has been criticized, among other things, because, of course, it sounds anachronistic, but also other polis in the ancient world always need to recruit elsewhere. Now, what I would like to argue is that Athens, obviously, is different than other polis in this particular respect. I would like to argue that Plutarch is actually correct, and that there are many people who can usefully be employed at the Periclean building project in the city in the decades running up to the start of construction. And even though I don't have a smoking gun for this assumption, I do have little bits of evidence that suggest that already much earlier, the influx of craftsmen had happened in Athens, and that there are also indications that they didn't always necessarily leave after the Persian Wars. Right, now, so in order to examine this theory a little bit further, we're going to go back first to the late 6th century and see what construction went on, let's say, in the last 2 decades of the 6th century and the first few decades of the 5th century up to the end of the Persian Wars. Now, this is a small selection of the building program that was started partially under the Pisistratids and partially under the early democracy. And even simply this list, which is a condensation of a very much larger list in the book by Jessica Paga, which was recently published on the early democratic building program, already involves huge numbers of man hours and different crafts that need to be employed in order to make them happen. Some of these were started in the second or third decade of before 500 BC, and some of them ran on well into the 470s. And even if you simply look at a map of the Agora around 500 BC, it becomes very clear that the last few decades of the 6th century are a period of construction by first the Pisistratids and consequently the early democracy. Now, to give honor where it is due, I have also copied from Jessica Paga's book these even more impressive lists that also detail, for example, where the materials for several of these temples and other buildings came from and when precisely they were started and in some cases ended. So if you take Attica as a whole, instead of simply just looking at Athens itself, then the scope of building in this period is truly staggering. And clearly, in terms of people who are directly involved in the actual building, sculptors, masons, carpenters, but also others, as we will see in a minute, must have been enormous. And these people must have come to Athens in the period between, let's say, the 530 and 500 BC in order to find work here. What these lists, however, do not show is something that you could maybe describe as hidden work. And by that I mean, this obviously is all monumental architecture or infrastructure. It is a very specific, very visible, also in the archaeological record, kind of evidence. However, we also have indications that other types of work were executed. For example, there is a reference to Cimon ordering a re-landscaping of the Agora, a process during which many trees were planted. Now, this is not something that you're going to find in the archaeological record, but it does require work. So this is the first way in which we have to add to the estimate of the work that we're looking at here. A second way in which we have to add to it is that the people who actually, let's say, have their hands on the object itself, and Anne was already just now referring to this kind of process, are not sufficient to make the building happen, obviously. Because if you are a mason, somehow or other, your marble blocks that the building is going to be constructed from need to be quarried, loaded, transported, offloaded, before you can even start working on them. To give you an indication of some raw materials, and I rather stupidly left out wood, which is another major item on the shopping list, so to speak. For metals, you need mining, the ore needs to be brought to a smelter, the ingots then need to be brought to the workshop of the blacksmith or the bronze caster or whoever it is that needs it. So a whole production process precedes the moment where the person who is making dowels for some kind of construction can even actually start producing those dowels. The same applies obviously to quarrying. The marble for the early democratic building program, if we may call it that, much of it came actually from Paros and therefore had to be shipped. So this is yet another, let's say, production line coming into Athens and probably bringing quite a number of sculptors along with it, for that matter. of course, by the time that the Parthenon is being built, we have almost certainly a so-called lithagogia road, which means a transport road specifically for the moving of large blocks of stone, for which the evidence has been found in several recent excavations now. And that road must also have been built. If you look at things like pigments, but also sand for glass production, then there is bone, there is textiles, there is materials for rope. In short, Plutarch's list is a good list of all the different crafts that you need. And especially with mineral and organic pigments, they are often produced in very specific places. So this involves long distance trade. And of course, in setting up the network of such a long distance trade, other things come with the material, and it all goes to the places where the large construction processes are. So we have actually so far two things that we have to add. First, we have to add the invisible work that did happen, but we can't see it now. Then we have to add what you might call the secondary crafts, so the support crafts that actually provide all the materials for the people who are hands-on involved with the construction need in order to be able to do their work. And then we have a third group of craftspeople who are involved. And these craftspeople are the ones that provide clothing, shoes, tools, food, perhaps shelter, but it also involves a number of trades, like, for example, washing clothes. So a third group of people made their living from actually providing daily sustenance, means of living a decent life for the craftspeople who were in the first two groups. And since the people in the first two groups were in fact earning a good wage, they could afford to pay for that. And this is a point where you can speculate that markets retail centers, if you will, must have been emerging. And the question is, can we find any evidence of those? Can we find any evidence of secondary and tertiary craftspeople working in Athens at this time? And the answer to that is yes, we can. So in this graph, we have two sets of columns. The dark red ones are sculptors' signatures, not dedications, signatures. And this is something that I will come back to a little bit later as well. But it is quite remarkable how many signatures there are on votives on the Athenian Acropolis. This tells us a number of things. First of all, it means that there were a lot of sculptors in Athens. Second, in some cases, we can tell where the sculptors came from, either because we know from literary sources or because they simply state it right out. And among these sculptors, actually, quite a few are not from Athens. A considerable group is from either the Cyclades or even other places. The third thing that you can sort of speculate about with these signatures is, why did they do it? Because as we will see, there are more signatures in Athens than in other places. I will come back to that in a minute. The orange columns in the graph are other professions and crafts. So what do we have? A fisherman, a washerwoman, a couple of fullers, a textile worker who dyes textiles, probably. We have a whole range of people that most definitely fall into our third category of providing materials for the other two groups to live off. And these people were doing well because they can afford to actually dedicate a tithe, a tenth of their earnings to the goddess, usually it's to Athena, Ergane, and in some cases they even sing the praises of techne. So, in this lovely epigram, which is from the early 5th century, the dedicant claims that it is a good idea for everybody to develop a skill. Because if you have a skill, you will always be able to make yourself a living. And apparently he or she did, because they managed to make this tithe. Now, of course, this is just after the turn of the century. We don't know exactly which year it would have been, of course, but it is an indication that there is a group of people in Athens at this time who are very confident craftspeople, who are very confident in their identity as craftspeople, and who do not object to being seen as craftspeople and the wealth that they have amassed through plying their trade. And there is a second little snippet of information about the presence of, let's say, retail in Athens around 500 BC. And that is in vase paintings. So this is two different vases, as you can see. So on the right-hand side, we have the A and B side of a single vase. And all of these are what you might describe as market scenes. So in the first vase, amphora on the left-hand side, a man is praising his probably oil, and the lady is pointing at what she would like to purchase, or maybe she is questioning. Anyway, there is a lot of pointing and talking going on. And on the second vase, and obviously this is my favorite here in the middle, there is a young lady stood on a table because she is having new shoes fitted. And again, there is a lot of pointing going on. There's a gentleman on the right-hand side who is pointing and probably saying what he thinks is a good idea, but then again, the girl herself is gesturing too, so she probably has other ideas. And then on the B side of the same vase, we have a blacksmith's workshop where, again, people sat on the side are telling the people who are working how to do their job. Very typical, isn't it? So there aren't hundreds of vases with these kinds of scenes, but there are enough to suggest a very important situation here. And that situation is that there was a market for these. People would buy them. And who is more likely to buy a vase than people who actually ply these kinds of trades, who actually do this kind of work? So, in short, we have a presence of craftspeople suggested by signatures, by dedications, by face paintings with scenes of craft in late black figure pottery, and even by some very explicit inscriptions like this one here. What does all this tell us? What it suggests to me is that as building came off the ground, literally and figuratively, in the late Archaic period, first under the Pisistrates, but especially also in the early democracy, there was a wave of immigration of especially craftspeople coming into the city. And as these craftspeople started working on the various building projects that were ongoing, other craftspeople were able to make more and more of a living. Now, in the early 6th century, there had been a rule, allegedly, that if you came to Athens plying a trade, you might get citizenship. This is part of the Solonic corpus, and it is not quite unambiguous. And more importantly, we also don't know how and if it was implemented in the later 6th century. But if you are making a good living, why would you leave? So the chances are that by the time that the Persian Wars began, many of these craftspeople were simply still there in Athens, working away at the various building programs that were ongoing. And then we get to a bit of a sticky point. Because the question is, what did they do after the Persian Wars? The city is destroyed. It obviously needs rebuilding. But we know that quite a number of the craftspeople at this time leave for other building projects, for example, on Sicily, where they have their own moment of building flurry around 480 BC. The question is, however, how many of these people remained in Athens? And if you think about things like the Themistoclean Wall, the fortifications of Piraeus, the planting and the re-landscaping that I was talking about earlier, but especially also if you think about the rebuilding of houses and workshops and just ordinary dwellings that needed to happen at this time, there was actually still quite a lot of work to be done in Athens. And we have some evidence on the Agora, for example. The house of Mykion and Menon was built initially around 475 BC, and there are several houses on the street of the marble workers that have the same initial dating and then later are reconfigured. So at least a chunk of this labor force must have remained in Athens to do this work. So time goes on, craft goes on, the city is being rebuilt, and of course we can't really work out when they were done. But let's say, for argument's sake, they were done in the early 450s BC. And let's say that meant they were out of work, and so they were thinking, should I stay or should I go somewhere else? And this happens to be the time when almost certainly Pericles is starting the design of the building project. Now, that is rather a beautiful coincidence, I think. The fact that at the time when there is a group of people in the city who are finished, quote unquote, with the work, and who will either leave or become very difficult in society, and who don't want to go and be in the army, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? That is, in fact, exactly what Plutarch describes. And the reason that, another reason that I think that Plutarch might be right, that it is at the same moment that we, for the first time, see tiny little bits of evidence, very tentative evidence, of the status of the metoikos, the metic. So, in later sources, it is mentioned that the children of metics, specifically the sons of metics, are the skaphephoroi in the Panathenaic procession. So the status of metic, of course, is not full citizenship, that is clear. But it does offer you an official position that is sort of confirmed contractually, you could say, by paying the metic tax. And the status of metic means that you can actually take part in the rituals, the most important sacred rituals of the city. So it isn't citizenship, but it also isn't nothing, if you know what I mean. It is by all means a status that is worthwhile. So what we have here is a depiction from the 450s of a skapheforos. And interestingly, in front of this skapheforos is a hydriaphoros, as you can see over there. The sources say that the hydriae in the Panathenaic procession were carried by the daughters of metics. And this is a boy. However, the exact same deviation from the sources occurs on the Parthenon. So, what can we say about this? From the late 460s into the 450s, I would propose that, let's say, unemployment or lack of work begins to kick in after the extensive building of fortification, rebuilding of housing, and cleaning up of the sites that needed to be cleared for the recovery of, for rebuilding the temples of Athens on the Acropolis. Some craftspeople undoubtedly left for other projects elsewhere, but it is unlikely that they all left because of the simple fact that there was still so much work to be done. And we don't know what kind of status these craftspeople had, but if a sizable number of them had come maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago to Athens and were in a sort of limbo in terms of citizenship status, they weren't quite citizens, they weren't quite non-citizens, strangers, they had been there for a long time. That leaves us indeed with exactly what Plutarch describes, a group of unwarlike manual laborers without work that had no means of taking part in the rising wealth that occurred in Athens in the first half of the 5th century. So in this period where this problem starts emerging, the Athenians may very well have thought back to the early days of their democracy and thought, what made us all thrive in those days? And the answer to that question was a large project that gave people work. So in a way, it is quite possible that Pericles' building program was a sort of reflection almost of the earlier building program, and that he full well understood what the consequences, the positive consequences of such a program would be. It is even possible that the tentative formation of the metic status was in fact to make sure that these craftspeople wouldn't leave, that they would stay in Athens and drive the economy forward as they had done before. So in short, I think it is very possible that Plutarch is correct. There was a throng of unwarlike Athenians. They were unemployed. And because Pericles and his contemporaries had seen what it could do to keep them, they went out of their way to do so. That is the end of this lecture. I would like to make one final remark. I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Andrew Stewart, who very recently passed away. He will be dearly missed by us all. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay.
Helle, thank you very much for a really interesting lecture with a lot of food for thought, I'd say. When I was preparing for your lecture and to sort of look at the strands of information that came out of this, I couldn't stop but thinking that there were some interesting parallels going on between what you were presenting and the work that is going on also in the late Bronze Age. You are probably all familiar with the building projects that went on in the Argolith, with the citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns and Medea, with the Tholos tombs that already started in Mycenae earlier than that, with a lot of grave construction in the region, and so on. And when you start looking at these aspects from a labor cost perspective, you realize that when you look, for example, at the labor costs of only the citadels, that you come up with a rather large amount of people involved in constructing. And the question has always been, are these people free people or slaves? But in the end of the day, if you want the workforce to be healthy and to be able to continue constructing long term, you don't want to exhaust these people by not providing proper nutrition, housing, and social environment which is conducive and supportive of their activities. They, of course, also then bring along other people that need to help and support them. So very similarly, we see people in support of them for nutrition, because if they build full time, 8 hours a day, there's no time in even an agrarian society that they will find space and time to do this. There's no space and time as well for them to carry out making of clothing. The same for tool making and so on. By the time you start adding all these, let's say, labor costs together, and especially when you look at the housing and the agricultural activities in support of the society from which the builders come, then you look at astronomical multiplications of costs in comparison to the actual builders. And this is pretty much what you're seeing as well here, which is very interesting. So for me, that parallel, although the situation is completely different and so is the context, and in your case, in Athens, it seems that people are there to stay, and the political situation and the building program of Pericles helps them to stay and helps to perpetuate the need for labor over time. This is not necessarily the case at the late Bronze Age. We see for a certain period of time a larger growth of people in the region, until even after the so-called demise of Mycenaean society for another couple of decades, and then it goes downhill, people disappear. There's no project anymore, there's no big project anymore attracting people in the region to stay and to execute more construction. But what I really also interested me was the fact that you have all these people coming together, and when you read texts by Demosthenes and other people, you know that they were communicating all the time together. So they were also sharing information and sharing knowledge. Yep. Interestingly, I think it was Demosthenes, but you correct me because I'm less familiar with the literature. He actually says that it's really important for good citizens and good people as part of a community to go to workshops and chat with others. To be social, to hang out.
Hang out in the shop.
Yeah, to hang out in the shop and to chit-chat. And some other people are actually against the idea of the chit-chat. Why don't you just work instead of chit-chatting? But both aspects are equally conducive to continue crafting and continue labor. So there's an awful lot that comes out of this talk, and I'm really happy that you presented this. I'll stop here. Does anyone have questions related to these topics? Go ahead.
So this sort of not to be Persian invasion area from was destroyed. You mentioned at the beginning that there was a lot of gold and a large labor force. I imagine that the Persians, when they came and destroyed everything, they took all the reserves of the city.
They did.
Where did the payment for all these laborers come from?
First of all, from the silver mines at Laurion. And second, from the loot that the Athenians took back from the battlefields of the battles that they did win, which was quite considerable because, as you probably remember, the Persians tended to travel with quite a lot of materials and entire families and so forth. So the wealth was less the problem. On top of that, of course, the treasury of the Delian League was moved to Athens also, and partially used to pay for the Periclean building program. That is very true.
You mentioned about the continuity in the presence of some craftsmen, and also you mentioned about signatures.
Yes.
Do we have any evidence from the signatures, secure evidence, like that people permanently stayed in Athens and left?
There are no certainties in this subject, I'm afraid, but there are some sculptors of whom we have what you call repeat signatures in Athens. So up to sometimes 6 or 7 in one case, 7 individual signatures of different works by the same sculptor. So at the very least, that suggests that that sculptor was not averse to remaining in Athens. The question of exactly how sedentary or not at all sedentary sculptors were is a tricky question, as I think you are very aware of. But it yeah, we know of a few examples of Athenian sculptors who then go and make works for other polis. This, for example, Endoios is invited over and over again to go and to other places to make statues. But that said, I'm not sure if that qualifies as traveling around, because what he does is he goes there and he comes back to Athens, and then he has another signature in Athens, and then he goes somewhere else. You see what I mean? So there is a difference between being itinerant, like not having a sedentary place that you reside at, and being a much preferred sculptor who is invited over and over again to go to different places. But yeah, this is a tricky issue, which is a different issue that I've also been working on, but haven't included as much in this lecture.
If I may, a second question.
If I may interrupt, because the people at Zoom cannot hear the questions that the crowd.
I'm sorry.
Can you please repeat them?
Of course, yes.
Thank you very much. And we have also comments on the chat.
Yes, so we bring this screen down and then we see the comments on the chat, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
First, you can
The
ask me the
second
question.
question is about the fact that there are the presence of signature sculptures are more abundant than any other crafts. Is it because it was considered more prestigious, more than there were more? You know what I mean? Like,
Yes, I need to repeat the question. Okay, so the question is, are there more signatures of sculptors on statues because it is a more prestigious craft than other crafts?
more evidence is left than other crafts.
Yeah, well, very simply, sculptors can sort of do what they want. They can put a signature on the statue or on the gravestone, for that matter, which they also did, if they choose to do so, and the patron kind of has to put up with it. And of course, if you are a textile worker or a fuller, then you're not necessarily in a position to sign anything that will actually survive for us to read the signature. You see what I mean?
Like other kinds.
Yeah, pottery is signed, of course. Yes, absolutely. But that isn't always from a votive context or from a grave context. But most definitely, there are also pottery signatures. You're right. I should have included those into the graph, really, because there are quite a lot of those as well. It's a good point. I will take that on board. Should I?
Let's have a look at yes. Joris Papastamos.
Louis.
He's raising.
Yes. Yorgos.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good evening, everybody, and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it very much. I heard things that I had never thought before. It was very stimulating, and I think two things came to mind as you were speaking. Two words, actually. One is appreciation. I never thought of it, that these people were appreciated. Their work, their products were appreciated for practical reasons, but it seems they were really appreciated. They wanted them to be there and do work. And it seems to me that we can, they were so much appreciated that we can reversely see that other people, like sculptors, sometimes were treated like craftsmen. For example, the inscription, one of the inscriptions that mentions the cost for the Erectaion came to my mind as you were talking, that where the sculptors are paid for figures. They are named the sculptures, the names are given, but the figures that get sculpted for the frieze of the Erectaion are not just, they say it's just a figure that is on a horse or a figure that is standing. So in not very appreciative terms. So they are treated like craftsmen, and that shows the appreciation from another perspective that they had from real craftsmen, like you said, shoemakers or miners or stonecutters or whatever. So this is, I think, very important, a very important sociological, let us say, aspect, this appreciation of this work. And what I also found very interesting, and the other word that came to my mind, is pride that these people, I mean, I refer to the inscriptions up on the Acropolis, they seem to have a lot of pride for their profession and for their achievements in life, which is very, very important. I'm not sure if it's the same what with Plutarch describes. I'm not very familiar with Roman history. Isn't it the time of Plutarch that there were this huge unemployment in the Roman Empire, so people were needed and there were not enough, but there were not enough jobs. So maybe he's describing things from his own perspective.
Absolutely.
Whereas in the 6th and 5th century, what you have in the inscriptions up on the Acropolis is that from people who are really proud of themselves and their professions.
Yeah, there is no shame in being crafts. That is absolutely true. Yes. To come back to your point about the Erechtheion inscriptions, I think it is also important to remember what the Erechtheion inscriptions and other building inscriptions are. They are essentially an account of what has been spent. So the people who are writing it are not the people who have ordered the sculptures. They are the people who are doing the books, literally. And they are accountable, and it's a tricky business because if they get it wrong, they will be prosecuted, of course. So there may not be much appreciation coming out of those particular sources, but I think that is partially because of the nature of the sources. At the same time, there is your name up on the stele as one of the sculptors of the Erechtheion frieze. You know, that is not to be sniffed at either. So it's yes, the nature of the sources is as you say, but at the same time, if I was a sculptor who had worked on the Erechtheion, I would take my kids and say, look, there's Daddy's name. You see what I mean? And this is the kind of context that we're talking about. I would be surprised if that had never happened.
Yeah, no, it is very complex. You're correct. I mean, it's multi-level. It's not just one level to see to this. But thank you very much. This is really very stimulating indeed.
Nice. Okay. Shall I read out some of the questions in the chat? Right. Mr. Politis is making some very valid comments, I see. So we need a clearer definition of crafts. That is certainly so. And I think that is pretty much what we will be doing in the next so many lectures. So this is a good starting point, I suppose. Then second, masonry is conducted in situ at quarries such as Charistos. And that is absolutely true, of course. There is an amount of addressing the stone already before the stones leave the quarry to reduce the weight and so forth. And so the question then always is this done by the sculptor who goes to the quarry? In the case of building projects, maybe less so, certainly when these infrastructures are in place for moving the stones. So that would mean that you also have masons at the quarry who are doing the preparation work. But yeah, this is definitely a very interesting aspect of the affair. And pieces were re-employed as building material, and interestingly also as stelae. I have a sneaking suspicion that one reason for the abundance of gravestones in the late 5th century is that there were lots of little bits of stone lying around that you could use to make a nice gravestone on.
And there is also enough evidence that, especially when it's limestone, that limestone, when it's broken down, or even when it's not broken down, is actually smashed down in smaller bits to be calcined into material for lime plaster. So it also completely disappears as building material. So the cycles of repair, reuse, recycling, and so on are endless, even with stone.
Yeah, and certainly from a very early period onwards. And yes, indeed, well, this is actually saying the exact same thing. The pottery sherds used for mosaic paving, papyri overwritten and reused, and so forth. So the economics of the craft market. Right, I understand the point. So basically, maybe there wasn't as much labor necessary is the point, because there was also the phenomenon of recycling and reusing. That is, I mean, it is certainly something to think about, that we have to switch off our modern consumer kind of attitudes when it comes to the ancient world, because those attitudes, of course, did not exist. And I will definitely make sure to think about that more and include that in the matter. Absolutely. Thank you very much for that.
Are there any other questions in the room at the moment, or comments to be made? Eleni?
A comment. Thank you very much. It was really stimulating. George is very right in that. And I really enjoyed it because it was a very eloquent example of how political economies are formed, and how important is the role of craft people in that.
Yes.
We have several examples throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
It's really very interesting how the societies change in a very structure because of population change, the professional groups, the large projects.
Yes.
Stimulated by the government of the politics.
Absolutely, yeah. That it's an interaction, isn't it? So,
maybe we should just summarize first.
Yeah.
Eleni Konstantinidis really commented on the fact that she thought this was a very good example of how political economies were actually formed in the specific periods, and how crafting and crafters were contributing on a very active and a very prominent role in such contexts.
Yeah, yeah. So I was going to say, I think that, of course, we are focusing on cross-craft interaction, but it is almost impossible, as also just commented in the chat, it is almost impossible to separate that from the rest of society, because, of course, also the percentage of people that were made a living in craft was a large group in society, especially because we know that people who lived off that land were a very small group, a very small elite, especially also in Athens. So even though the wealth standards in Athens in the 5th century are relatively high, and there seems to be something that you might label as a kind of middle class, arguably this middle class consists to some extent of these craftspeople who then actually have quite a lot of pull in society. And well, it is known of Pericles that he also hung out in workshops and chatted to the craftspeople. So I think that the image that they were sort of marginal in Athenian society is one, you know, for the past. That's everything points in the direction of them also in the 5th century still being much appreciated, which then leads to Socrates not being negative, but instead using that for his philosophical conceptualizations.
Yeah, and in fact, if you see how many people were involved in that community and how big that community was, this is also actually a force to reckon with in political circumstances, because if they grouped together because they were not happy with certain circumstances, they had a voice and certainly also the power to potentially interfere with the political government as it was and set up resistance within the workshops or the places where they were gathering. And it seems that these workshops were definitely the places to be, to hear the latest news, the gossip, and the tendencies of what people were thinking and speaking about, not just in terms of crafts, but also the political situation.
You hear the news on the market, essentially. That's you go to.
That what led to the formation of guilds, etc. in later periods.
Yeah,
of course.
absolutely. Certainly.
Somebody else?
Shall we conclude?
Yes.
The first lecture. Would you want to say some closing words?
I'm first of all very happy that we had a stimulating talk, a very interesting context that brought open lots of interesting points to discuss. I think some of these will be picked up again in following lectures for sure. We have lectures coming up on the 26th of April and on the 31st of May. So if you're in Athens, you're very welcome to join us for those as well. The same counts, of course, for everybody who cannot be here very welcome online. The Zoom link will be open for that day. I'd like to thank Helle for having taken the courage to do this first talk, because it's never easy to start a new series. So thank you very much, Helle.
You're welcome.
And please come upstairs with us for a quick drink as well. Thank you.